Hello friends, now we are going to start the most important chapter of GST lecture series, that is the time of supply, that is chapter number 8. And you can expect at least minimum 2 marks question from this chapter alone. 2 to let's say up to 5 marks question you can expect from this chapter. And if they ask more than 5, it will be a bonus for you. First, let's try to understand why time of supply is very important under the GST. Because it is the time of supply when the tax liability get extracted. So, for example, if a person is having so many goods to sell or supply, and this person will supply these goods to any other person. But if he does not supply these goods throughout the year, there will be no GST liability. But on the other hand, the moment he will supply these goods, let's say at this point of time he has supplied these goods to another person, then the liability to pay GST will get attracted at this point of time. So here the time of supply is also known as point of taxation. That is that point of time when the GST liability get attracted. And there are 3 important sections which are related to this: section 12, 13 and 14. And section 12 and 13 talks about the time of supply of goods and services respectively. So point of taxation means the point of time when the goods have been deemed to be supplied as per section 12 or services have been deemed to be provided as per section 13. Now, why this point of taxation is so important? Because at this point of time only you have to check the rate of tax which will be applicable for that supply, the value of supply you have to calculate at that point of time, and it also decide the due date for payment of tax. Suppose this has been supplied at this point of time. So as you are aware that the payment under GST is made on monthly basis or quarterly basis. So whenever there is a supply, you have to check under which month this supply is falling or under which quarter its supply is falling, and accordingly you have to file the return and pay the GST to the government. So the bottom line is that the liability to pay CGST or SGST will arise at the time of supply, which will be determined as per section 12 or 13 of CGST Act. Now, as we have already seen that the provisions of a point of time of supply is divided into 2 sections mainly. Section 12 talks about time of supply of goods, whereas section 13 talks about supply of services. So all these 2 provisions, both these 2 provisions are almost similar. So if you can get a control over section 12, so automatically you will get a control over section 13. That is almost similar provisions are there in section 12 and 13. There are minor differences which we will see later on. So now we are going to see section 12 first, where we will see the point of taxation for supply of goods. So section 12, that is the time of supply of goods, can be studied under 4 parts. First, normal cases, the time of supply of goods in normal cases. Then the time of supply of goods in case of a reverse charge. You will see it later on. And third is time of supply of goods in case of voucher. And if we are unable to find the time of supply with the above method, then we will apply the last method to determine the time of supply of goods. Now first let's talk about the time of supply of goods under normal cases. So the provision is very simple. It will be date of issue of invoice. So I am writing DOI, that is date of issue of invoice or date of invoice, or date of payment, whichever is earlier. For example, suppose this was the supplier and this supplier has supplied these goods. ये goods इसने supply किए हैं किसी दूसरे person को, and for such supply he has received the payment on this date. Let's assume this date is, let's say, 1st of October 17. This is the date of payment. And suppose for this supplier has issued the invoice. Invoice इसने जो issue की थी वो let's say 18th of September 2017 को he has issued the invoice. That is, the date of invoice is 18 September 2017. So for this supply, interestingly, you will note that कि इसने कब supply किया था ये नहीं देख रहे हैं. What we are focusing is the date of issue of invoice for this supply or the date of receipt of payment for this supply. ये दो चीजें आपको देखनी है. And whichever is earlier will be treated or deemed to be treated as the time of supply of these goods. So in this example, you can see that the date of invoice was 18th of September and the date of payment was 1st October 17. So this is earlier. So the date of supply or the time of supply of these goods will be treated as 18th of September 2017. Now there is another point you have to remember. Suppose ऐसा मान लेते हैं कि इसने इनवॉइस इशू ही नहीं की. मान लीजिए जो सप्लाई किया है गुड्स, whatever goods he has supplied, he has not issued the invoice at all, but he has received the payment as on this date. Now in this case you have to check the last date, that is the last due date for issue of invoice for this supply. Let's assume the last date for issuing the invoice for this supply was, let's say, 30th of October 2017, then you have to check the earlier of these two. That is, the last date of issue of invoice was 30th of October 2017 and the date of receipt of payment was 1st October. So whichever is earlier. So in this case, if he has not issued the invoice or he has issued the invoice after the due date for issue of invoice, so you have to check the last date, last due date for issue of invoice for such supply and compare it with the date of payment. Whichever is earlier will be the time of supply of these goods. So in this case, the earlier is 1st of October 2017. So this will be the time of supply of goods. So if you look at it closely, you will find that you have to compare between the date of payment and the date of invoice or the last date of invoice, that is the last due date on which the invoice should have been issued. So you just have to compare the earlier of these two and that will be treated as the time of supply of goods. So this is very very important और इसी particular point के ऊपर एग्जाम में क्वेश्चन डायरेक्टली पूछा जा सकता है. Now let's move further. If the supplier receives an amount up to 1000 excess, यानी यहाँ पर ये जो supplier है इसने goods supply किए and suppose he was supposed to get 20,000 rupees for this supply. इसके लिए इसको कितना मिलने वाला था? 20,000. But somehow he has received 1,000 extra. So total amount he has received is 21,000 for this supply. So you can see that in the invoice में कितना amount show किया था? 20,000, but he has received 1,000 extra. Or you can say he has received up to 1,000 rupees excess of the invoice amount. Then the time of supply for this extra amount, यानी यहाँ पर 20,000 के लिए तो ये आपका रूल लगेगा A और B, whichever is earlier. And for this 1,000 extra which he has received, the time of supply will be the date of issue of invoice. Date of invoice will be the time of supply for this 1000 rupees extra he has received for this supply. And this is at the option of the supplier. यानी ये इसके पास option है कि ये AB का rule न लगा के for excess amount which he has received up to 1000, he can take the date of issue of invoice as the time of supply of goods for this 1000 extra amount. तो इसके ऊपर भी क्वेश्चन आ सकता है, and you have to remember this date of issue of invoice will be treated as point of supply, will be applicable only if he received amount up to 1000 extra. Another thing which you have to remember कि invoice में जो भी amount mention है, so as we have seen that this person has supplied goods and whatever invoice he has issued and the amount mentioned in that invoice, the law will assume that the goods have been supplied to the extent which is covered under the invoice or for which he has received the payment as the case may be. Now, as far as receipt of payment is concerned, इसको payment कब मिला, ये डेट कैसे पता करेंगे, तो इन्होंने यहाँ पर explanation दिया है. The explanation is given for the date of receipt of payment. That is for point number B. They says that the date of receipt of payment shall be earlier of following two dates. The date on which the supplier entered the payment in his books. तो यहाँ पर पहली तो बात कर रहे हैं बुक्स में जब भी आपकी एंट्री हो गई है, पेमेंट जो रिसीव हुआ है उसकी एंट्री whenever you have entered in the books. And second, the date on which the payment is credited to the बैंक अकाउंट, या फिर बैंक अकाउंट में जब आपका वो अमाउंट क्रेडिट हुआ है. So whichever is earlier will be treated as the receipt of payment for such supply. So please remember, in this question, एग्जाम में जो क्वेश्चन पूछा जाएगा वहां पर आपको डायरेक्ट डेट ऑफ पेमेंट हो सकता है नहीं दी हो. That is, instead of date of payment, they can say that for this supply, the payment what he has received, he has entered the payment in his books on, let's say, 1st of October 2017, or let's say the amount has been credited to his bank account on 3rd of October 2017. So यहाँ से आपको पहले date of payment निकालना पड़ेगा. So date of payment will be whichever is earlier. So 1st October 2017 entry in the books and amount credited into a bank account was 3rd of October. So whichever is earlier will be treated as the date of payment. And then with this date of payment, you will compare with the date of invoice or last date of issue of invoice, and then you will be able to ascertain the time of supply of these goods. Another thing which you have to note specifically here is that date of payment we have used just for simplicity. It is basically the receipt, date of receipt of a payment by the supplier. You have to check this. And the date of receipt of payment can be arrived, as I already mentioned, that when the amount is entered in the books of the supplier or it is credited to his bank account, whichever is earlier. Now let's see the time of supply under reverse charge cases. तो reverse charge case क्या होता है पहले ये समझ लीजिए. Normally the person who is supplying the goods is liable to pay the tax to the government. यानी this person who is a supplier of goods will supply, whenever he supply the goods to another person, then this supplier is supposed to collect the GST from the recipient of goods and deposit the same to the government. But there are few cases, situation where the recipient of goods is supposed to pay the tax directly to the government and not the supplier of the goods. This is called the reverse charge cases. So now we are going to see how the time of supply will be determined in case of where reverse charge method is applied. So in case of a reverse charge, the time of supply will be earliest of the following three dates. तो पहली डेट है receipt of goods. this recipient of goods, whenever receive these goods, that is the receipt of, that is the date of receipt of goods. You have to check the date of receipt of goods. Second, you have to check the date of payment, when the payment is made by this recipient of goods. And the third, the date immediately after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. तो तीन चीजें देखनी है आपको, date of receipt of goods, date of payment by the recipient, and the date immediately after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. Now let's take one example. Suppose this is a supplier and he has supplied these goods to following this recipient, and under this case the reverse charge method is applicable. It means the tax will be paid by the recipient of the goods, not by the supplier. So first here you have to check the receipt of goods, that is date of receipt of the goods. Suppose the date of receipt of the goods, it's let's say 10th of October 17. The date of payment made by recipient to the supplier, let's assume that this date is 15th of October 2017. And the third date which you have to check, the date immediately after 30 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So suppose the date of issue of invoice was, let's assume it was 1st of September 2017. Then you have to add 30 days and next day immediately from this, you have to take that date. So 30 days from this date, that is up to 30th of September, and then the next date will come on 1st of October 2007. That is, you just have to add 30 to the date of issue of invoice by the supplier. So you will get the date, that is 1st of October 2017. Now you just have to select the earliest of these three dates. So now here you can see that the earliest date is 1st of October 2017. So this will be the time of supply in case of a reverse charge. That is, in case of supply of goods under reverse charge, this will be the date of supply, or you can say the time of supply. Now there is a slight difference in case of a time of supply of service under the reverse charge. So in case of supply of services, all the points are same, that is A and B are same. In case of a C point, instead of 30 days, you have to check the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier of service. तो सर्विस के केस में, सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस के केस में आपको इंस्टेड ऑफ 30 डेज आपको क्या लेना है, immediately after 60 days from the date of issue of invoice in case of supply of services. So suppose this is a case of supply of service under reverse charge and not supply of goods. So you have to, instead of 30 days, you have to take the 60 days from the date of issue of invoice by the supplier of service. And in that case, the date will become 31st of October. That is, from 1st September, you have to add 60 days, you will reach 31st of October. And in this case, if you check the earliest of these three, 10th October 2017 will be the date of supply of service under the reverse charge. That is the time of supply of service under reverse charge. Now let's get back to the main provision under the reverse charge. It says that when it is not possible to determine the time of supply from these three, that is A, B, C are not available, or whatever may be the case, if you are not able to calculate or find out the date from A, B, C above, then the time of supply shall be the date of entry in the books of account of the recipient. याद रखना, date of entry in the books of accounts of the recipient and not the books of account of the supplier, because it's the case of reverse charge. Reverse charge में आपको recipient के point of view से सारी चीजें देखनी है. So if it is not if you are not able to find out the time of supply from ABC above, then the date of entry in the books of account of the recipient will be treated as the time of supply under reverse charge. Further, they have given an explanation on date of payment. याद रखना, आपको पूरा recipient के हिसाब से देखना है. You have to check from the recipient point of view. The date of payment will be the earlier of these two, that is the date on which the recipient enter the payment in his book. तो ये जो recipient है, इसकी बुक में इसने जब कभी भी अपना जो अमाउंट है वो एंटर किया है बुक्स में, वो डेट चेक करनी है, एंड द डेट ऑन विच द पेमेंट इज डेबिटेड फ्रॉम हिज बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट. यानी रेसिपिएंट का जो बैंक अकाउंट है उसमें से वो अमाउंट कब डेबिट हुआ है. Earlier of these two dates will determine the date of payment. So suppose in this case directly date of payment is not given. Instead of these two dates are given. The first date when the recipient of these goods or services has entered this amount in his books of account. Let's say he has entered on 15th of October 2017. And the second date is given the date when the payment was debited in his bank account. Let's say 16th of October 2017, the payment was debited in his bank account. So you have to check the earlier of these two dates to arrive at the date of payment. So in this case, you can see 15th of October is the earliest date. So this will be treated as the date of payment. Now let's see the time of supply of goods or services in case of a voucher. First, let's try to understand the concept of voucher. Suppose this is a person and he wants to buy some shoes. Shoes purchase करना है इसको. And suppose this person gets a voucher from any person that this shoes he can buy on the basis of these voucher from this mall. ये एक मॉल है और इस मॉल के यहाँ पर बहुत सारी shops हैं, and from this shop he can purchase, this person can purchase on the basis of this voucher, he can get the shoes from this mall. अब यहाँ पर दो चीजें हैं. Whether at the time of issue of voucher, let's say the date of issue of voucher के दिन, if the supply can be identified at that point, then you have to take the date of issue of voucher as the date of supply of goods or services. On the other hand, they says that if supply cannot be identified at the point of issue of voucher, suppose voucher has been issued to this person and this person can get any goods or things from this mall up to this value, let's say 10,000 rupees. So in this case, which goods he will get from this mall is not clear on the date of issue of voucher. So in this case, the date of issue of voucher will be irrelevant and you have to check the date of redemption. That is, the date of redemption of a voucher will be important if the goods cannot be identified at the time of issue of voucher. So to determine the time of supply of goods or services in case of voucher is very, very simple. You just have to check the date of issue of the voucher and also check whether the supply can be identified at this point of time, that is on the date of issue of voucher. And if the supply can be identified at the time of issue of voucher, then the date of issue of voucher will be treated as the time of supply of goods or services. On the other hand, if you are unable to identify the supply on date of issue of voucher, take the date of redemption of voucher as the time of supply for goods or services. Now let's come to the last method to identify the time of supply of goods. Now this method will be applicable when the time of supply cannot be determined from the above method what we have already seen. If it is not possible to determine the time of supply by the above provision, then simply you have to check two dates. The date of periodical return, that is the date of return when it has to be filed, you have to check that date. That will be treated as the date of supply, that is the time of supply of goods or services. But in case you have paid the CGST or SGST, अगर आपने उसके लिए वो supply के लिए कुछ tax pay किया है, then in such cases the date on which the CGST or SGST paid will be treated as the time of supply for goods or services. Now let's see the time of supply in case of addition in the value of supply. यानी आपने supply किया था let's say for 10,000 rupees and recipient was supposed to pay this amount let's say within 1 month or whatever may be the case. But he has delayed this payment. The recipient has delayed the payment, and because of this delay, the supplier also receive addition, that is in the form of interest, late fee or penalty. So as per the contract between the supplier and the recipient of goods, if there is a delay in the payment of consideration, the recipient will be liable to pay the interest or let's say the late fees or the penalty for delayed payment of consideration. Now suppose this amounts to 2,000 rupees, that is 10,000 तो supplier receive करेगा ही. Apart from this 2,000 supplier will also get extra amount because the recipient has delayed the payment of consideration. Now this addition in the value of supply, this 2,000 is also related to that supply. So this 2,000, the time of supply will be the date on which supplier receives such addition in value. तो ये जब कभी भी supplier को मिलेगा ये 2,000 rupees extra, that is the addition in the value of supply, that date of receipt of such addition will be treated as the time of supply for goods or services. For this addition in the value, यानी 10,000 का जो आपका time of supply है, that can be different, and this 2,000 rupees which he has received, इसका time of supply separately calculate होगा and it will be directly linked to the date of receipt of this addition. Now let's see the provision of time of supply of services. Till now we have seen the provision of time of supply of goods, but the time of supply of services have been mentioned under section 13, and we can study these in 4 parts as we have studied the time of supply of goods in 4 parts. So if you can see these 4 parts, the first case is the time of supply of services in normal cases. There is a little bit difference what we have seen the normal case of supply, time of supply of goods and time of supply of services. There is a small difference in normal case that we are going to see. After that, there is another case of reverse charge, that is the time of supply of services. Here there is a small difference, only 60 days should be replaced with the 30 days what we have seen. 30 days we have seen in the time of supply of goods, but in case of time of supply of services, there is a 60 days time. So this is only the difference in case of reverse charge for time of supply of services. Then voucher exactly same, and the last method is also same. So we are mainly going to discuss this normal case, and there is one more point in case of time of supply of service, supply of service by associated enterprise. This is additional point in case of time of supply of service. So this we are also going to see. Now let's see the time of supply of service under normal cases, and for this you have to see this first, that is the date, the due date up to which the invoice should be issued if you are supplying the services. So this is mentioned under section 31(2). So due date of issue of invoice in case of goods is mentioned under section 31(1), and due date for issue of invoice in case of supply of service is mentioned under section 31(2). So these things you have to remember, but we are not going to see these two sections right now because we will get diverted from our main topic. So now let's see how to find out the time of supply of service under normal cases. So it is very simple. First you have to check whether the invoice was issued within the time prescribed under section 31(2) or not. If the invoice for supply of service was issued within the time limit which is mentioned under 31(2), then simply you have to check the date of issue of invoice, that is the date of invoice, and you have to compare it with the date of receipt of payment, that is the date of payment you can say. So if the invoice is issued within the time limit, then you have to check the date of invoice, and the date of payment, whichever is earlier, will be treated as the time of supply of service. So this provision is almost similar to time of supply of goods, but there is a twist in case of time of supply of service. If the invoice is not issued within the time limit which is mentioned under section 31(2), if the invoice is not issued within that time limit, then you have to check the date of service, that is the date of provision of service. कब आपने service provide की है वो check करना है, and you have to compare with the date of receipt of payment, that is the date of payment से check करना है. Whichever is earlier will be treated as the time of supply of service. So main difference, if you can see here, you have to check the date of provision of service, that is the date of supply of service. In case of goods, you need not to check the date of supply of goods, but here in case of services you have to check the date of provision of service if the invoice was not issued within the time limit which is mentioned under 31(2). So always you have to check with the date of payment, that is the date of receipt of payment. So in short, if the invoice is issued within the time limit, then you have to compare the date of payment with the date of invoice, whichever is earlier will be the time of supply of service. If the invoice is not issued within the time limit, then you have to compare the date of payment with the date of service, that is the date of provision of service. So whichever is earlier will be treated as the time of supply of service. Now this section further says that in case the provision of clause A and clause B, that is clause A and clause B, both do not apply, then in that case the date on which the recipient of service showed the receipt of service in his books of account will be treated as time of supply of service. So please note that this is the supplier of service and this is the recipient of service. You have to check the book of the recipient of service. Whenever you see the receipt of service recorded in the books of recipient of service, that date of receipt of service will be treated as the time of supply of service when clause A and clause B are not applicable. Now let's see another point, that is the supply of services by associated enterprises. So here you have to remember, whenever there is a supplier of services who is located outside India. So if let's say this is India and there is a supply of service from outside India. तो supply कहाँ से हो रहा है? Outside India से हो रहा है to the recipient of service in India. Then in such cases you have to check the date of entry in the books of accounts of the recipient. So this is the recipient. इसकी जो बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट है उसमें आपको एंट्री देखनी है, डेट ऑफ एंट्री इन द बुक्स ऑफ रेसिपिएंट एंड द डेट ऑफ पेमेंट. यू हैव टू चेक दीज टू. Date of entry in the books of account of the recipient or date of payment, whichever is earlier, will be treated as time of supply of services by associated enterprises. And now we are going to discuss another very important point, that is the time of supply of goods or services in case of a change in the rate of tax. यानी आपने गुड्स सप्लाई किए हैं या सर्विसेज सप्लाई की हैं और जब आपने सप्लाई किया है उसके आसपास ये रेट ऑफ टैक्स चेंज हो गया है उस गुड्स और सर्विसेज के सप्लाई के ऊपर लगता है. So whenever there is a change in rate of GST in case of supply of goods or services, you have to check the time of supply, and this time of supply in case of a change in a rate of tax, we can study these provision into two parts. When there is a supply of goods or services before the rate changes, so if there is a change in rate on this particular date and the supply has already been done before the change in rate. And second case is that when the supply is made after the change in rate. So rate means here rate of tax. So there is a change in rate of tax and you have made the supply either before the change of rate or after the change of rate. So first we are going to see how to find out the time of supply if goods or services were supplied before the change in rate of tax. So these provisions are very simple and it is very easy to understand with the graph. So we have drawn some graph and first we are looking at the case of time of supply before change in the rate of tax. So suppose this is the time of change of rate of tax and the supply of goods or services already made before the change of rate. So here there are three cases and in each case you can see your case is falling under which case and you can find out the time of supply in case of a supply before change of rate. So let's go to the case A. Situation A में ये कहते हैं कि goods have already been supplied before the change and the invoice issued as well as the receipt of payment is after the change of rate. It means supply जो हुआ है वो rate change के पहले हुआ है but invoice issue हुई है after the rate change and the receipt of payment is also after the change of rate. So it is very simple. You just have to check the earlier of these two. That is the date of issue of invoice or date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier will be treated as the time of supply for the supply of goods or services made before the change of rate. Now let's see the case B. In case B also, the supply has already been made before the change of rate, but the issue of invoice has already been made before the change rate, but the payment is received after the change of rate. So here the date of issue of invoice which was made before the change of rate, that date of invoice will be taken as the time of supply of goods or services. And in case C, where the services have already been supplied before the change rate, but the invoice is issued after the change rate and the payment has been received before the change of rate. So in such cases, the date of receipt of payment will be treated as time of supply of goods or services. So it is very simple. अगर आपने goods supply किए हैं before change of rate, there are three cases. In situation 1, that is case A, both invoice issued as well as payment received are after the change of rate. So here you have to take the earlier. But in case B or C, you just have to check which one was before the change rate. So invoice was issued before the change rate, then you have to take date of invoice as time of supply. And in case C, you can see the date of receipt of payment was before the change of rate. So you have to take date of payment as the time of supply. And now we are going to discuss another case when the supply is made after the change in rate of tax. So now how to find out the time of supply if the supply is made after the change in rate of tax. So we are into this situation. So here also there are three cases, case A, case B and case C. Now let's see the case 1 where the supply is made after the change of rate but both invoice issued as well as the payment received before the change of rate. So in this case, whichever is earlier, that is the date of issue of invoice or date of receipt of payment, whichever is earlier will be treated as time of supply. Now let's see case B and case C in case of supply of goods or services after the change of rate. So case B में ये कहता है कि suppose invoice is issued after the change of rate but the payment was received before the change rate. So you have to take the date of issue of invoice as the date of supply of goods or services. And in case C, we see that the date of receipt of payment, that is the date of payment is after the change of rate, but the issue of invoice was before the change of rate. So here you have to take the date of receipt of payment as, that is the date of payment as the time of supply of goods or services. So now the whole picture is clear, that is the time of supply which is mentioned under section 14. ये section भी याद रखना है. Section 14 talks about time of supply where the supply is made before the change in rate of tax or after the change in rate of tax. So you can see that I have explained the section 14 with the help of diagram, and there is the purpose of explaining whole this concept with the help of a diagram, because at the end you will be able to understand it very easily. So now the whole diagram is in front of you. Now it is very easy for you to identify the time of supply in case of change in rate. First, let's see the supply was made before the change of rate. So you can see the supply is on left side, that is before the change of rate. So if both invoice issued and the receipt of payment is after the change, you just have to take the earlier of these two as the time of supply. But if you can see B and C, it is very simple. If the invoice is issued before the change or payment is received before the change, then you just have to take these as the time of supply. On the other hand, if you see if the supply is made after the change of rate of tax, that is on the right side, if the supply is on the right side of change of rate and both invoice issued as the payment received both are before the change of rate, then the same principle, earlier of these two you have to apply as the time of supply. And in case B and C, you can see whichever is closer to the supply inside of the supply, that is in B case you can see the date of issue of invoice in the right side and the payment was left side, that is the payment was received before the change of rate but invoice was issued after the change of rate. So the date of issue of invoice will be treated as time of supply. And in case C, the payment received, that is receipt of payment is towards the right, that is it is after the change of rate but the invoice was issued before the changes. So you have to take date of payment as the time of supply. So based on these discussion, again final touch we can give that if supply is made before the change of rate and both invoice issued as well as the payment received is after the change, you have to take whichever is earlier. Similarly, in this case also you can see the supply is after the change but the date of issue of invoice as well as the date of receipt of payment both are before the change. So you have to apply the principle earlier of these two. But B and C cases are very simple to identify because in both B and C cases you can see that both invoice and payment are in different sections. That is, one is before the change of rate and one is after the change of rate. So if the supply is made before the change in rate, you have to check the date of invoice or the date of payment, whichever is before the change. You have to take that date as the time of supply. And if the supply is after the change of rate of tax, then you just have to check invoice issued or payment received, whichever is after the change in rate of tax, that will be treated as time of supply. Further, in both these situations, you have to remember the date of receipt of payment. That is what we have seen, the date of payment shall be the date on which the payment is entered in the books of account of the supplier. यानी supplier की जो books of account है, उसमें आपने entry कब की है, when it was entered in the books of account of the supplier, that date will be treated as date of receipt of payment, or the date on which the payment is credited to his bank account. यानी supplier के bank account में ये payment कब credit हुआ है, whichever is earlier will be treated as the date of receipt of payment. So exam में आपको direct date of receipt of payment नहीं भी दिया होगा, but they might have given the entry in the books and a date on which it is credited to the bank account. You have to check the earlier of these two will be taken as the date of receipt of payment.